going to be an exciting. A lot of preparation has gone into this, and it's a new topic for most of us. And it is also something that is in vogue and likely to take a much larger space in the way philanthropy is going to work in the near future and also for the long term. Of course, there are two sides to every topic, and there are those who are vociferous about innovative impact financing and those who are skeptical about it. Would request each of you to form your own view, judgment, and apply it in your own circumstances. Of course, the speaker is quite well versed in this particular domain. He is working day and night on this issue. It's my pleasure to introduce the speaker for today's Sai Dev Talk Session 3. This is a platform where alumni of Sathya Sai education institutions who are working currently in the development sector as full-time professionals come forward to share their insights, their learnings, their experiences, their journeys prior and after they have ventured into the development sector in a full-time capacity. With prayers to Swami, I would now like to introduce the speaker for today, Kundan Madhi Reddy. Kundan is an alum from Sathya Sai Institute of Higher Learning. He did his BCom honors. He completed his BCom honors in 2010. Then he completed his MBA in 2014, distinguished gold medalist of the Masters in Business Administration program with specialization in finance. He also did his one-year fellowship with the Sri Sathya Sai Vidya Vahini program. In addition to being a change agent at his school, he was also instrumental in designing, in putting together and launching a very innovative program called as Masti Ki Prayogshala, which wanted to bring back the zing in the study of science at schools, creating a platform and a bridge for youth in the society to engage with school children and ignite that spark and make science education really creative, practical, insightful and innovative. Thereafter, he did a couple of projects and then pursued his master's in public policy at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. And then, of course, currently he is a practicing freelancer consultant in the domain of social financing. He is currently handling live projects with Social Finance India. His detailed profile is available on LinkedIn. It is quite exhaustive. Something that each of you would could go and read further. Without taking additional time, just quickly mention to you about how this session will progress. About for first 20-30 minutes or so, Kundan will make a presentation, during which if you have any questions, you can type it out in the chat window. Post his 20-30 minute presentation, you can then take turn to raise your hands and then the co-hosts or the hosts will unmute and you can express your question to the speaker. Yeah, that's it for now. Over to Kundan, and thank you, Kundan, for making available your precious time, putting in efforts, weeks of efforts to put this all together in a way that will be appreciated and understood by all of us. Over to you, Kundan. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Gadi, for the introduction, and thank you very much for even setting up this platform. I think it's a great initiative in bringing all the alumni together in terms of discussing social and development sector issues. There's a huge alumni group out there in this sector, and I think it's very heartening to have a common platform where we can share and discuss things with each other. So much for that. And before I kickstart today's discussion, I'd like to express my prayers to everyone here in this group who are joining us currently and who have not joined us yet. Prayers to their families, and I know that there's a lot happening currently in the country today with the COVID scenario breaking out again, and prayers to everyone in the group and in the team for their families to be safe and healthy. Having said that, I think we can start the session, and Gadi, thank you once again for organizing this today. I'll share my screen and I'll take you through a quick presentation which talks about the overall and the broad contours of what innovative impact finance is and what we'll be covering in this session. And I'm aware that from the registration forms that have come in that the topic and the different themes in this topic are new to many members in this group. So having that context in mind, I'd like to give a good overview on what this topic means, what are the different instruments used in the sector, and how does social financing happen generally in India and globally. With those quick thoughts, let me jump straight in. The goals of the session are threefold. The first one is to understand the entire world of pay for success financing. And when I say pay for success, there are multiple terms that are used for it. Some call it results-based financing, some call it pay for success, some call it outcomes-based financing, essentially understanding what that means in the context of the development sector. The second main goal of the session is to understand the mechanics of how social and development impact bonds work, how are they structured, what role do those instruments play, and some of the examples that we have in the world today. And the third important goal is to discuss and understand the role of PFS in improving the effectiveness of social sector and public spending in the world. And so these are our entire discussion will be guided by these three main goals. And reiterating what Manoj Gadi has said, people are welcome to ask questions either directly in the chat box or by raising their hand, and the coordinators of the session will unmute them so that they can ask their question directly after I complete the presentation. So this is the agenda that we'll follow. First, I'm going to talk about the impact continuum that we have in terms of the social financing instruments that are there in the world today. And every day we get thrown different terms and different words in terms of different social financing instruments. There are a huge variety of instruments out there, right? There are blue bonds, green bonds, social bonds, impact bonds, and different kinds of instruments. So where do they fit in? How is this impact continuum shaping up across the entire social finance universe? That's going to be the first agenda item today. The second agenda item is about the theory of change and how pay for success financing instruments fit into the entire theory of change models. The third is specific discussions on DIPs and SIPs, and I'm going to take you through how the mechanics work in different SIPs and DIPs. And the fourth one, we're going to close the presentations with a couple of case studies. So I have a few case studies for you today, and depending on how much time we have, I'll either cover some of them or all of them, depending on how the presentation goes through. So with that, I'll quickly jump into the impact continuum of the social finance sector. Pardon me because there's a lot of text on this slide, but the idea is to give you an overview of how this whole thing shapes up. So as you can see here, financial instruments in the world today are categorized on a very broad spectrum. On the left side of the spectrum over here, on the left extreme, you have instruments that are purely financial-led instruments, the equities and the debt instruments that we see today, be it debt bonds or equity share capital, or the shares that we invest in companies today. That is on the left side of the spectrum, where the focus is traditionally on getting financial returns out of our investments. And if you see it on the right side of the spectrum, you will see that a lot of the instruments are based on the grant side of things, where philanthropies give grants to nonprofits, governments give grants for different programs. So this is the broad spectrum, and in between the spectrum, there are different shades of financial returns and societal returns. And depending on what extent a financial return and a societal return merge, there are different instruments and different ways projects are run. So in between, you have instruments, social impact instruments like microfinance funds, healthcare funds, structured debt, social bonds, which are a good blend of both financial and social returns. And if you keep going towards the left, you will start seeing more financial returns coming into the instruments, and which are the regular ESG funds, ethically screened equity funds, other mutual funds. And if you go towards the right of the spectrum here, you will see that the instruments become slightly more focused on the societal returns part of it. So this is a very broad spectrum, and there are like tens and I would say hundreds of instruments across the spectrum, across the world. And what we're going to be focusing today are specifically on a blend of financial and social return instruments, which are typically the impact bond structures, which has impact first, but that doesn't mean that financial gain is a sacrifice. There is a financial return on the instruments like impact bonds, but majorly there is a lot of societal and impact return as well. So when you say social finance or impact investing, this is a huge broad canvas there, and I thought it is important to lay down this context before we jump into the specific aspect of the discussion today. So pay for success is going to be the main theme of our discussion today. And as the term itself says, you pay only for success. That is the underlying feature of any instrument that falls into the pay for success bucket. And as you can see, pay for success, as Brookings defines it, is a confluence of three different trends. So one is the impact investing sector, the other is payments only for specific results, and the third is about public-private partnerships. So any pay for success instrument or a pay for success model or design would bring all these three together. And as you will see in some of the examples and explanations, a good pay for success instrument works by bringing these three together so that the overall program is successful. So before I jump into specific instruments like SIPs and DIPs, it's important to understand where these instruments feature in the entire theory of change model. So as you can see here, many of you might be familiar with the theory of change model, where for any social sector intervention or a development sector intervention, we map out the entire logic chain of that program right from inputs to impact. And so the inputs are the things that you generally feed into the program, things like say manpower hours or funding, right? The inputs that go into the program. The activities are the activities that happen in the program, say building something or teachers teaching a class, right? There are many activities in a program, and then the outputs of any theory of change model are the end goals of activities that happen. So in terms of say building a school or building a classroom, toilet, those come under outputs of a social model. And of course, I'll take you through specific examples in two of the projects that I worked, but to put it in a general parlance, what happens is most of the funding that we see today in the social and the development sector is focused on activities, inputs, activities, and outputs. A lot of the funding that you see today, be it in government schemes or be it in grants that philanthropic organizations provide, a lot of the funding is targeted towards the inputs, right? We know that many governments fund building of schools, they fund building of toilets or many of the other activities. And similarly, even grant-based programs are directed towards activities. So what is happening in pay for success is that the entire funding model is shifting from an input activities and output focus to an outcomes and impact focus, because that is where the real change comes. Having funding outcomes is what is the main model of a pay for success instrument. So now I'll take you through specific examples of the projects that I've worked. So one is a skills development program for which our team has built a preliminary design of an impact bond when I was studying back in the National University of Singapore. So as you can see here, if we map a skills development program on the theory of change logic chain, you will see that inputs like training curriculum or classrooms or any training that we provide are part of inputs, and the activities are actually any counselings that happen, trainings that happen, and any internships that take place. And similarly, you will see that the next lever is outputs over here, where there's a specific focus on the number of schools or number of employers or the number of students who have completed training, and the outcomes are the outcomes and the impact are what happen after we provide these activities and outputs, where you see increased wage employment, increased wage generating capacity, increase in the technical and leadership skills of students. So this was a theory change of a skills development program that we have worked on. As you can see, the entire logic moves from an inputs focus to an impact focus, and the focus of pay for success instrument revolves around the outputs and impact rather than on inputs, activities, and outputs. And a similar example from a different sector altogether, which is urban sanitation. So this is another project that we had worked on, and both these projects are India-based projects. The earlier skills development one was for a non-profit offering soft skills training in India. And this urban sanitation program is for another organization that was building fecal sludge treatment plants and waste treatment plants for towns and cities in India. So here, as you can see, the urban sanitation program, a lot of the inputs and activities are based on providing manpower, constructing toilets, constructing waste treatment plants. And as you go forward in the outcomes and impact part, you can see that many of the outcomes are around positive behavioral change in terms of using toilets, in terms of reduction in improvement in health outcomes or reduction in mortality outcomes, right? So some of these are the outcomes and impact parameters for this urban sanitation program. So the main idea of a pay for success instrument is that unlike grant-based programs where the funding revolves around paying for inputs and activities, many of the pay for success instruments like impact bonds focus on paying for the outcomes that that a nonprofit or an organization can deliver. So with these two examples, I'd like to take you through the structure of a development impact bond. So there's a misnomer around the term. While bond generally means a financial instrument that pays interest regularly or has a regular coupon rate, and then after X number of years, there's a repayment done, right? That's the general idea and understanding of a bond. But a development impact bond, though the word bond is there in the entire term, it works slightly differently. So I'd like to bring your attention to the left side of the slide, where the way a development impact bond, which is a pay for success instrument, works is that there is a party called an investor who first gives money to a implementing organization, which is usually a not-for-profit. And that money is given like a working capital where the not-for-profit organization, and it could be a for-profit as well. There are some DIPSIP structures where for-profits are also implementing organizations. So it could be a not-for-profit, it could be a for-profit, it could be a mix of those organizations, but essentially it's an implementing organization. So what happens is the investor first gives money to a implementing organization, and the implementing organization executes that entire project. So if we take the two examples that I discussed before, if it's say a skills development organization, the implementing organization would run soft skills programs or do some kind of technical training for the candidates, right? It would run its program with that money. And if it's a sanitation project, in the example that I discussed before, the organization would be say building toilets or promoting social behavioral change programs, right? Or a mix of those. And once the implementation organization completes those services, there is an independent outcome evaluator who would verify that whether the outcomes have been met or not. And depending on how successful the program is in terms of outcomes again, and when I say success, it's all predefined over here. So say for a skills development organization, the couple of outcomes will be how many students have gotten jobs in good companies, how many students have been placed with say a minimum salary of 10 or 15,000 rupees, or how many students have managed to stay in a job for at least a year. So these are some of the different outcomes that a skills program can have. And if it's a sanitation program, some of the outcomes could be what is the extent to which open defecation has reduced in a particular city, or to the extent to which health outcomes have improved in a particular locality, right? So there can be different outcomes depending on the project. So whatever those outcomes are, they are predefined in advance and the targets are defined in advance. So what the independent outcome evaluator would do is understand from the data if the program has been successful. And if the program is successful, there is another party called an outcome funder, which is in a development impact bond. Traditionally, outcome funders have been philanthropic organizations, and any kind of philanthropic organization can be an outcome funder. And traditionally, we have seen big organizations, say like USAID or any other bigger foundations, who have been outcome funders. They repay money back to investors along with the rate of return. So what happens, quickly, I'll recap the structure over here. So an investor first puts money in a non-for-profit. The not-for-profit then implements the program over a specified period of time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, depending on the structure of the program. And once the program is implemented, or once parts of the program are implemented, an independent evaluator verifies and certifies that the outcomes are met. And depending on how successful the program is, and there are going to be many thresholds that are going to be defined. Let's say 10% improvement, 20% improvement, 30, 40% improvement, right? Depending on the program again. Depending on how successful the outcomes are, a third-party funder pays the investors the original investment that they have earlier given to the non-for-profit, along with the rate of return. And the rate of return is tied to the success of the outcomes. So this is a traditional development impact bond structure, the way it works. And this is a plain vanilla design, and different impact bonds can take different shades of this design and build structures which look similar to it. For example, what happens in a social impact bond is that the structure majorly remains the same, but instead of the outcome funder being a third-party philanthropic organization, say like a USAID or a Gates Foundation or a Ford Foundation, the outcome funder in a social impact bond is typically a government. It could be a city government or a state government or a central government, but typically the funder's role is replaced by the government, and the government would in turn pay back investors their share of the money. So that is a major difference between a development impact bond and a social impact bond. And the other major difference that we see is that in a development impact bond, many of the issues that are catered to are in developing countries that include, say, sanitation or education, where the outcomes happen later and there is no savings associated with that outcome. It's an outcome in itself. But what happens in a social impact bond is many of the SIPs that are being implemented around the world are savings programs for the government. So I'll give you a quick example. And of course, we have a case on a SIP as well. But to give you a quick example, let's say that it's a mental health program in a developed country. And the issue with a lot of mental health cases is that if patients do not get good mental health treatment, then the chance that they're going back to hospitals and incurring heavy costs for the government are extremely high, right? So what some of the mental health programs do is that not-for-profits treat the patients in different ways by, say, giving them some behavioral therapy, giving them social support, economic support, in a way that those people are absorbed back into society. And what happens is that because the mental health patients are absorbed back into society, they do not burden the hospital health systems with additional treatment again. And that would result in a lot of savings for the government. So the government would use that savings to pay the investor who initially funds that program. So these are some of the differences between a SIP and a DIP. And as you can see on the right side of the slide, and we'll discuss that in detail slightly later, but essentially there are cases where you can use DIPs and there are cases where you cannot use DIPs. So specifically in terms of social programs, every social program might not be DIP ready. Only some social programs can be funded by DIPs, and some of the reasons are where we have some evidence of what a program can do. There's some kind of data there, and the service provider is in a position to scale up the entire program using a DIP, right? So there are some conditions and pre-requirements to use an instrument like this to fund a social program. And going to the next slide over here, this will give a quick overview on the impact bond landscape in the entire sector over here. So as you can see, countries like the UK and US have had many impact bonds because they've been in the space for almost a decade. And in fact, the first impact bond was launched in the UK in 2010. It's almost been a decade from the time these instruments have started financing social projects. And a lot of impact bonds have been done in UK, US, and even in India, we have a few impact bonds. And on the right side of the slide, as you can see, these are some of the issues that are covered with impact bonds. And a lot of these issues are based on employment and training, the kind of example that I just spoke about. And a lot is also focused on child and family welfare, homelessness, health and well-being. And so these are some of the impact bonds that are around the world. And if anyone is interested in knowing more about the specific examples and what different countries have done and what are the different impact bonds in the specific sectors, I'd encourage you to go to the GoLab website, which is the University of Oxford's Government Outcomes Lab, and they have a very good database on the different impact bonds that are being launched around the world. And this is another innovation in Pay for Success again. This is not an impact bond per se, but it's a different variant of an impact bond is what I can say. And as you can see here, it's a social success note over here. So many of the stakeholders remain the same. There's an investor, there's an outcome payer, there are beneficiaries, there's a monitoring organization, there's a social enterprise. But what happens here is that the investor gives a loan to a social enterprise, and the social enterprise then repays the investor that loan back. And depending on how successful the outcomes are, an outcome payer would probably pay the investor and also the social enterprise an additional payment depending on how successful the program is. or he could, or the outcome payer could pay either of the enterprises over here. So it takes a slightly different form of a pay for success. And there are so many other formats as well. There are social impact guarantees, and there are many other instruments which, and if somebody is interested, there's a whole universe of social financing instruments out there. And specifically going to the case studies. So before I jump into the case studies, I'd like to see if there are any questions so far. Sure. Yeah, I think there are no specific questions here. I can jump into the case studies. So what I've done is I've taken cases from across the world. I've specifically not taken any India-based cases because some of the projects that were done in India, like the Educate Girls DIB or the Utkrishta Impact Bond, have been well spoken about in India. So I won't be covering Indian examples today, but I'll be giving examples from both the SIB and the DIB world that have happened across the world. And if time permits, I'll cover all cases, else I'll just stop at one or two cases. So the first case I have here is the entire Cambodia rural sanitation DIB. So this is the world's first impact bond for rural sanitation. So the project that I had worked on earlier that I shared about was an urban sanitation project, where the focus was mainly on waste management, but this project is slightly different, and this is a project that has already gone live. And in this project, some of the facts are displayed here. What the implementing organization is doing is it's creating local sanitation markets for local entrepreneurs to build toilets, promote behavioral change in these rural communities so that more and more people use toilets. And as you can see here, Stone Family Foundation is the impact investor. It's first giving money to the implementing not-for-profit here, which is IDE. And depending on how successful IDE is in turning 1,600 villages into an ODF-free status, USAID would then pay back the Stone Family Foundation, the investment it earlier provided, and also a rate of return depending on how successful the project is. So for every village that becomes ODF-free, USAID would make a payment to the Stone Family Foundation. And this is first of its kind rural sanitation DIB that was launched in Cambodia. And the other important part of a DIB is, I think, which I've not covered in detail earlier, is the entire innovation around the DIB. So what happens normally in a traditional grant-based financing is that the donor usually recommends or mandates that the not-for-profit follow specific guidelines or specific activities as part of the program. And that has been a major problem for many of the not-for-profits, because say a program is not working, and if the not-for-profit wants to tinker the program or change parts of the program to make it more impactful, its hands are tied because it has agreed to a specific set of activities and processes with the donor. But in a pay-for-success model, there is a lot more leeway for the implementing organization to change its business model, to change its implementation model, to ensure that the outcomes are met. So that doesn't mean that there are no guidelines. There are broader principles and guidelines within which the implementing not-for-profit can add staff if it requires, change infrastructure if it requires, or change the type of training it provides if it requires. There's a lot of leeway and maneuvering room for a not-for-profit to reach those outcomes. So that is a very important advantage of the pay-for-success model. So this again is an ongoing project that has just started in 2019. And the idea is to ensure that the villages become ODF by 2023. So this is a DIB example in a developing country setting. The second case here is a SIB model, a social impact bond model in a developed country setting, which is the United States over here. So this is a very old SIB that was launched in 2012. And here the focus of the project was on reducing recidivism, where not-for-profit was funded to ensure that people who are going to jail, so Rikers Island is a major jail in New York City, where the focus was on adolescents, people who are between 16 and 18 years old. So what happens with many of them is that a lot of these adolescents, once they go to jail and and get released from jail, they eventually end up in jail again because of various factors like social exclusion, lack of income, being excluded from education and other programs. A lot of these youth end up going back to jail. So and what happens is, because they end up going back to jail, the New York City government spends a lot of money in catering to those inmates, and estimates are that they easily spend more than $60,000-$70,000 per inmate who lands up back in jail. So the idea of this program was to ensure that by giving some kind of a treatment, and as you can see here, by giving this treatment to these adolescents, the idea is that they would stop returning to jail. They wanted less and less people to return to jail, and all the savings that the New York City would make, that savings will be used to pay back the investors who earlier invest in the program. So here, as you can see, Goldman Sachs is the main investor in the program. Bloomberg Philanthropies was guaranteeing a part of that. So if the program is not successful, Goldman Sachs will get back some amount, which is here in this case is $7.2 million. And so whatever money is lent by Goldman Sachs first goes to the not-for-profit, which is a service provider here. And after the intervention is done, there is a assessment and a measurement of outcomes which is done. The structure is similar to the DIP structure you've seen here, but there are extra added elements over here. So once the program is successful, the New York City would then pay back Goldman Sachs its initial investment along with the rate of return. But as you can see here, this project is closed and discontinued because the intervention failed to reach its goals. So this is a key message here, that not all SIPs and TIPs are successful. There can be some that fail. And this is a case where some people say it is successful given that we have seen how a SIP works. But from a program perspective, the not-for-profits program did not ensure that a certain thresholds have been met over here. So the program failed in that respect. And so Bloomberg had to pay Goldman Sachs the guaranteed amount that shared earlier. So this is a case of a social impact bond in a developed country, which is the States over here. And the next example that I have is a career impact bond. This is again a form of a pay for success instrument, but not strictly like the DIP model, like the plain vanilla DIP model you have seen earlier. So what happens here is that it's again a skills training program. So let's say that there's a job training provider, which can be a for-profit or a not-for-profit. So the impact investors first provide money to a job training provider, and the job training provider trains X number of students in a specific course. And as you can see here, there are many active CIBs in the US, and different CIBs focus on different skill sets. Many are IT related, IT and tech related, some are non-tech related. So once the student is provided the training, it is also the job training provider's responsibility to ensure that the students are placed in good jobs at a certain minimum salary and in a good company. So once students get placed in those jobs, they share a portion of those earnings with the impact investors. So investors earn a return only if students are successfully placed at minimum threshold salaries in good companies. And a portion of earnings, again, this depends on how financially it is structured, right? It could be 10% of a student's salary for 3 years, 5 years, or 20% of a student's salary. It depends on how the instrument is structured financially. But essentially, if the student is placed at a minimum salary, the investors get back a portion of that salary. Else, investors risk losing capital over here. And from a student perspective, if you can see what's happening is, the beauty of the program is that a student doesn't have to pay the job training provider in advance. Let's say it's a regular program, you and I walk into a training company or a training organization, we normally pay for a course and then and whether we get a job or not, in most cases, there is no guarantee that we will get a job. And even if we don't get a good job, there is no guarantee that the job training provider would refund that fee to me. But here what's happening is, a student would have to share a portion of the earnings only if he or she gets a job at a minimum salary. Else the students don't have to pay anything. If the student does not get a job, he or she doesn't have to pay anything of it. If a student does not get a job at a minimum salary that was promised, he or she doesn't have to pay anything. So there is a lot of beneficiary focused structure that is getting built into a career impact bond. And these are the examples in the US, and there are many other CIBs that are in the pipeline in different countries as well. And this is again another way a pay for success instrument can be designed. And case number 4 is not a specific instrument, but it's an outcomes rate card. So what has happened is, this is again from the UK's context, because they've had a lot of experience with impact bonds from almost 2010. They have managed to take those learnings and make a traditional pay for and make an outcomes rate card through which they are even contracting government services. So if you see the first flow chart over here, normally the way a traditional pay for success works is that once a problem is identified and a service provider is selected, outcomes are then negotiated and an instrument is launched. But what is happening is, with all the learning that the UK government has had, it is setting rate cards. So as you can see on the right side, this is a rate card of a specific local government in the UK, where they are setting what the outcome prices are for each outcome. And any service provider can bid for this basis these outcomes. So normally what happens in many countries in the public contracting space or the municipal contracting space is that tenders are floated for, and where the different entities bid for the cost of inputs and activities. But here, bidding would happen at the cost of outcomes. So these are the maximum outcome prices that the UK government has publicized. And depending on each level of outcome or different type of outcome, a price is fixed by the government. And then the private entities can choose to bid on these outcomes and then contract for services. So this is an innovation in the UK. And the idea in many countries and places is that eventually the shift will happen to outcomes, where more and more public funding is provided only when successful outcomes are met. And so these are the 4 quick cases that I have for you today. And I'd like to go back to the initial DIB model and discuss few points which are specific to the Pay for Success program, given that we have gone through some of the cases. So as you can see here, a lot of innovation is being built here, where the implementing organization is not tied to a specific set of activities or processes. It can fund basis, it can do programs depending on how it wants to maneuver the program to ensure that those outcomes are met. And from a funder perspective, usually these funders, private donors, or even governments, as you've seen in some of these examples, they'll have to pay only if the outcomes are met. So if outcomes are not met, then a government or a donor doesn't have to spare funds at all. Unlike a common grant-based program, where funders usually pay upfront and there is no guarantee of impact over here. But in these instruments, as you can see, unless the program outcomes are met, the funders don't write a check to repay the investors. And these are the 4 case studies. And so these are some of the discussion points that I have today. And before I jump into this, I think we can take questions, Gadi, given that it's 6:40. We can start taking some questions.
Yes, Kunal, I think there are a few questions out in the chat, and of course, and there's one raised hand. Let me go over to the chat, and there's one question from Arya, which talks about force majeure clauses in terms of like COVID, how disrupting it is to the overall structure. Karthik has also raised a very pertinent point that asks if there is undue pressure on the NGO to show success rather than achieving success. By achieving success, I think he's trying to speak about addressing the problem at hand. Somebody has asked whether these are bilateral discussions and therefore agreements, or are they routed through any social stock exchanges? There's a question from Vijay to know if there are instances of these kind of instruments being availed for expansion or further penetration of community media services, especially for the internet excluded communities, radio excluded, internet excluded communities. So these are some questions. Yeah, and maybe after the chat, we can then go to some of the people who have raised their hands. There's the last one from Dinesh about interest conflicts between investor and implementing agency. What if a grant maker is more flexible? Then does it then remove the value add that an interest value add that an investor brings in. Sorry, I think I have bunched up everything for you.
Sure, I'll try taking some questions together.
Shall I reorder them for you?
No, I think I'll just take one question. I think that is common. I'll just put up that relevant slide. Yeah. So many of the dips and sips that usually get designed, and even some of the projects that I've been a part of when back in Singapore and even in India, a lot of the design happens in a very collaborative manner. And of course, investors and funders have major inputs on the programs. But what happens is it's a fairly collaborative process, given that there are outcomes to be set, there are prices to be agreed, there are programs to be agreed. So the kinds of collaboration that you will see and a stakeholder approach that you see in a pay for success instruments in terms of the parties coming together is very high. And a lot of the success of these programs can also be attributed to the fact that parties do a lot of discussion and negotiation analysis of data before doing programs like this. So from a collaborative perspective, each party would ensure that there are incentives built in for each of the parties. There are no disincentives for anybody in the program. And given that it's a collaborative process, many of the objectives that are usually not met in a traditional grant-based model are met in a program like this. Because what happens is that the investor also is heavily invested into the program. Because till the outcomes are met, the investor is not going to get back his money, right? So I think from a collaborative process, the pay for success model in general has a very high, I would say a very high premium on collaboration.
There are two hands raised. Should we ask one of them to unmute and?
Yeah, before that, is there any other question in the chat, Gadi, that we can complete? Then we
something
can
around conflict. So I think that got addressed in terms of the collaborative approach. I think Karthik's question, we can ask him to express it.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Manoj and Kundan, can you hear me? There's too much background.
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, thank you. So see, while this is said as an innovation, and we are also doing a lot of research on finding out right financial innovations, I feel, this is my personal view, I feel that a DIB or SIP is basically done by normal investors who invest in the market, who want to now move their money into the social sector. They want to see that there is actually some outcome from what the money that they have. But this, what they get is with them, the same idea that what they have put in the normal markets. If I do this much, I'll get this rate of return. So if I probably do the, if you achieve this goal, then I'll pay you this money. But in the development sector, we have seen that this doesn't work so easily. So one of my questions that I had put there is, when they define these success factors, the problem with both the implementation team and the impact investor is that they make sure that those success factors are achievable. Now, achievable success factors may not actually mean you're addressing the actual problem. For example, right? Kundan, you're talking about the same issue about building toilets and making villages ODF. Okay. One of the things that we have seen in Tata Trust is that the problem is not about building the toilets. Toilets can be built. The success factors there actually is the number of toilets built. Fine. But the other issue is, are the people actually using it for the right purpose? Are the people actually doing what they're supposed to do in a toilet? Not supposed to use it as a, a storeroom. And most importantly, something that we don't see is that once the toilet, for example, the waste is collected in those 2 pits, right? Somebody has to remove those things, So they need people to actually remove the sludge from within those 2 pits, which is built, which I have seen in most villages, people don't have people to do this. And so what happens is the toilets become useless after 1 or 2 years. So these are factors which are not usually seen outside on a normal basis. So my issue is, while DIB is actually an innovation, people are talking about innovation, is that innovation actually useful to the public in large?
Kundan, to that same question, Siddharth's related question is sustainability of behavior change. So could you add? So that was something that in the
Sure. Yeah. So one very important detail that we go into when designing a DIB or a SIP is the behavioral aspect of the entire program, right? So I understand what you're saying, right? It's not just enough if you build toilets, right? There's a whole value chain after that, right? What happens after you build toilets? There is a waste problem, there's a water problem, right? And there is a lot more after building toilets. It's just one part of the chain, right? So what happens in many of the DIB SIPs, at least the ones I'm part of, and some of the ones I've researched earlier for my projects as well, is that a lot of discussion between the stakeholders happen on behavioral change and disincentives, right? And the focus again, specifically in this Cambodia rural sanitation SIP, of course, I've summed it up in one sentence saying the intervention is building local sanitation markets, infrastructure, and behavior change. But if you actually look up that document, you will realize that there are a lot of aspects to that intervention in terms of not just how many toilets you have built, but ensuring that the surroundings are clean because the sludge is cleared, right? There are some health outcomes somewhere, right? So the entire mechanism is designed to ensure that the focus is on outcomes. So if it was just funding construction of toilets, then it's that usually doesn't figure in a DIB or a SIP, because the focus of a DIB or a SIP type of instrument itself is outcomes and impact and not inputs and activities, right? So a lot of behavioral change is inbuilt into the way we structure DIBs and SIPs, because in fact, one problem that we have designers of these instruments should address is that a very narrow focus on one outcome should not result in an adverse impact on some other outcome, right? Essentially, say you're having a school child, and if the focus is only math and science, right, that should not be at the cost of some other development that the child should have in the school. So a good SIP design would take all of that into account. Again, this is a financing tool, right? The good tool, the way we have to use the tool and the way we have to design is to ensure that those activities and aspects are considered. And at least in the projects that I've been a part of, behavioral change and behavioral disincentives are major parts of the discussion that we have with parties in the transaction.
Kundan, there's one question about, can you give us examples in Indian context, or is it too early? Aren't we seeing too many DIBs or SIPs in Indian context?
Sure. In India, there are a couple of DIBs that have been launched here. The first and the most popular DIB is in the education space. It's called the Educate Girls Development Impact Bond, which was launched many years back, and it is also closed, and it's counted as a very successful one, not just in India, but globally. It's a very successful DIB that has been done, which is done in the state of Rajasthan. And there's a healthcare DIB again. It's called the Utkrisht Healthcare DIB, where the focus is on maternal mortality rates, maternal and infant health and mortality rates. That's a healthcare DIB that was launched. And there is another DIB that was launched recently in the education space by Social Finance India, which is for school children in Haryana. So there are a couple of examples even in the Indian context as well. I don't want to go into details of every DIB because we don't have the time, but these are some of the examples you could actually explore, and there's a lot of information out there.
Yeah, I would request Ram Naresh to unmute and go ahead. I think you had something to ask.
Sairam Kundan and Sairam Manoj, just a quick question around the impact of blended finance instruments to basically fund projects which are probably have a quasi benefit where there is a social impact element at the start of the project, and the project has significant legs to become a commercially viable project. And obviously, most of the Western countries, I do know, they have basically used this kind of blended finance instruments where, say, first stop losses or initial financing is done through impact groups, and eventually there will be structures the structure allows them to basically seek mainstream private equity funding or equity financing, so to speak. Do you have any case studies where you have worked in the past, which talks about any of these blended finance instruments as success stories?
Sure. So I'd say that the access to private capital and mainstreaming that product to raise more equity and debt, for example, right, is what you are sharing. That might not work with all interventions. For example, say you're funding the not-for-profit, right? So if it's a DIB or a SIP that's focused on a not-for-profit enterprise, then that not-for-profit enterprise can probably demonstrate good impact, and the success it can use as part of the DIP SIP, it will be able to raise better grants going forward, right? But say if the same DIP SIP is focused on a for-profit institution, that is where the for-profit can prove its model and then probably raise mainstream finance from say an equity market or a debt market or private equity market. So it depends on the type of intervention and the type of organization that is the implementing entity as well.
So in summary, if I understood it correctly, so you're talking about potentially social enterprises that have a profit with purpose kind of a motive rather than pure philanthropic groups or charitable institutions potentially eligible for a blended finance instrument. Is that correct?
I'd say both are eligible, but what happens after that depends on the type of enterprise, right? So if it's a for-profit enterprise, once it proves a model using a blended finance instrument, right? Once the model is proved, once commercial scalability is established, then it can go to the market and raise funds from, say, private investors. But if it's a not-for-profit, then the same organization, once it proves its model, it can go and raise more grants from other donors. So blended finance would work in both cases, right? For-profit and not-for-profit. The examples that you've seen here, many of them are not-for-profit examples, but there are even for-profit examples that are part of blended finance transactions. And if you're interested, you could actually go check up Convergence Finance. They have a whole database of blended finance transactions across the world in different sectors. I think that will probably be a very interesting read for you to check it out.
Correct. So one last observation, Kundan. I know Harvard University is doing fair bit of research currently on establishing impact investment reporting, and they are at the moment as we speak, they're at the cusp of potentially releasing significant amount of white papers on similar to the likes of US GAAP or many other accounting standards. Do you have any more color on how is this reporting currently done in this kind of a sector in the absence of a standardized frameworks to provide reporting, just the likes of US GAAP?
Sure. Okay. Let me just go back to this slide. Yeah. So as you can see here in the entire impact continuum, there are different types of instruments over here, right? And the US GAAP and other financial standards usually focus on instruments on the left side of the spectrum, where the instruments are standardized. There are regular established companies, right? They have to report in a certain way. And then when you start slowly coming to the right side of the spectrum, for ESG risks and other sustainability-based reporting, we have the SASB, which is a Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which gives a lot of details on how a company should report on the sustainability part of its operations. And then when you start coming towards, say, traditional impact investing, we also have other organizations like the Global Impact Investing Network. We have the IFC's social bond principles, green bond principles that specify specific reporting formats and requirements for companies that are launching those instruments. But if you come to the very extreme right of the spectrum, where the projects are more socially oriented, then the reporting would depend a lot on the specific project and the sector it is in, right? Because the programs are non-standard, the interventions are non-standard, a lot of it revolves around the specific type of program. The reporting is not as standard as what you would find in a US GAAP or a SASB or a say social bond principle of the IFC. So it would really depend on the type of organization and the type of program it is in. But what I can say is there is no fixed standard framework for, say, the extreme right side of the spectrum here in terms of reporting.
Kundan, just in the interest of time, I also wanted to ask a question, so I did raise my hand to get into the queue. So just wanted to understand, see, we come from a school of thought which talks about give and don't expect, right? And that is one piece. So I want to try to fit this framework into the underlying philosophy of putting effort towards development. That is one. Two is NGOs per se to deal with a grant maker by itself is a huge challenge for them. And now we have to deal with a grant maker, we have to deal with an investor. Does it also come with adequate benefit beyond just money? I'm saying so much of coordination in terms of reporting. Does it make it all the more complicated, or do those activities also get adequately incorporated and supported for? What's the value gain for this? From bilateral, it is 3 parties or 4 parties kind of engagement. Ultimately, on the ground, the implementing organization has to deliver. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. So I'll take that question, and along with there's another question on the not-for-profit side of the game, where if the money is conditional, how would they be able to implement the program? All right. So I'll take those questions together. So one thing to note here is that in the development impact bond structure, the payment to investors is based on how successful the outcomes are, and so the payment to the not-for-profit is not fully conditional. So initially, as I've shared in the structure, let's say the not-for-profit is training students in soft skills, job skills, technical skills. The investor first gives money to the not-for-profit. So the money that comes to the not-for-profit to implement the program is not fully conditional on success. Of course, yes, there will be some success fee or an outcome fee, which the not-for-profit will get as a bonus if it really performs well. But the funding to the not-for-profit is not successful, is not fully dependent on outcomes over here, right? The payment to the investor is fully dependent on outcomes. And what happens is exactly that you said, right? The program here, and it's a major challenge of these instruments, that it's extremely expensive and time consuming to construct and design an instrument. So a DIP-SIP model will not work for every not-for-profit, right? The not-for-profit should have some capacity in terms of, say, a minimum resources it can come into to any program, a minimum operating budget, so that it's I wouldn't say it should be very big not-for-profit, but at least it should be capable enough in terms of its intellectual capacity, financial capacity, manpower capacity to be able to handle an instrument like this. And you might actually think that the not-for-profit might go into a lot of, say, reporting and all of that, but advantage of this model is that there's a lot of collaboration that happens between the investor and not-for-profit. And that collaboration would ensure that the not-for-profit focuses a lot on results and outcomes. A lot of the private sector rigor comes into these instruments, given the kind of parties that are involved, so that the not-for-profit can in fact improve on its outcomes and improve on its capacity. And the investor and funders also usually give a lot of capacity building support to the not-for-profit, where a lot of training is given, systems are set up for the not-for-profit, right? A lot of add-on benefits come as part of this program. So if it's an extremely small not-for-profit, yes, it might be extremely difficult for them to do a model like this. But if it's a not-for-profit that has the sufficient capacity, this model will in fact improve a lot of the working practices, working standards, and the performance of the not-for-profit as a whole.
Okay.
That's a major advantage to the not-for-profit, because as I've shared, what happens is once the not-for-profit establishes that its model is working, then it does not need a SIP or a DIP going forward. It can use that data to show that its program is working, and it can raise grant funding much more easily once it has proven that this program works. So of course, yes, it's a lot of work for the not-for-profit, but I think there are a lot of benefits that accrue to the participating organization.
I think there's one question from Soumya around how to get into this market, how to discover this market, who are the key movers and shakers? Is there scope for some private investors to get into the play?
Sure. So usually there have been a few, I would say a good group of institutions that have been investing in instruments like this, where the institutions themselves have a lot of impact focus, right? So one very popular example in terms of a risk investor in these programs is the UBS Optimus Foundation. You could look them up. And so what UBS Optimus Foundation does is the HNI clients of UBS, if they want to contribute to philanthropy, they put money in this foundation. And the UBS Optimus Foundation then invests this money into various SIPs and DIPs, and all the returns that it earns, it recycles it back to further investments. And similar to that, if many of the countries where these DIPs and SIPs have been launched, there are many such organizations As I've shared, if you can actually go to the University of Oxford's GoLab database, you will find a huge list of investors that have usually participated in instruments like this, the funders who have participated in instruments like this, and also the firms that are involved in this. And again, there are many popular firms that structure these instruments. So Social Finance Network is a very big network of firms, Social Finance UK, US, India, Israel, Netherlands, that structure these instruments in the respective countries. And there are other firms, say in South America, like Instiglo, that are quite popular. And in East Asia, there's a firm called Trisector Associates, of which I was a part of when I did some of these projects. And again, many countries have smaller boutique firms, smaller investment advisory firms that also get into structuring of these social finance instruments. So there are a lot of players. If you could actually explore the database, you will get a sense of which all firms are involved in projects like these.
I think clearly seeing the continuum of questions that are pouring in, there is clearly an unexpressed demand for session 2 of DIB. So clearly, I think we should organize something probably more in a workshop mode, and then it will help the parties, us understand as to how it progresses from an initial talk to designing and structure and rolling it out. So maybe sometime later, Kundan, work permits, time permits, you should please make it possible to do some kind of a hands-on workshop for us. I think it will be useful, especially for those who are not much familiar into this. Before we actually close, I'm just keeping track of time. We have a special participant today, Mr. Shrikant Bhagwat. He has joined in from Bangalore. He is the founder of Hexagon Wealth Advisors. So that's his professional part, making money for investors. And on his personal life side, he does enormous amount of service through the Satya Sai Seva organization, through the Rotary. So this seems to be at the intersection of using money for social good. Sir, a few words from your end about the presentation, about this concept of inviting the students working in the professional sector, development sector, to share their thoughts.
Yeah. Sairam Manoj, brother, first of all, thanks for inviting me into this extremely provocative talk and presentation, provocative to the mind and a challenge to the thinking. I think Brother Kundan made a fantastic presentation. Kudos. A complex new subject has been put forward to us in a manner which we can absorb and think through. And I don't think many of us will be sleeping through the night, because we'll be thinking of all the things possible with this concept. The way it has been put out, right from the theory of change and focus on outcomes, and then how we can finance the outcomes. What I find timely is India is in a place where CSR involvement is only going up by the day. Of course, pushed by the government, and now corporates are taking it pretty seriously, and there are functioning CSR divisions in most large business houses. On the one side, you have CSR houses, CSR foundations. On the other side is the formation in a very formal structure of family offices across the country. So what happens is, in the way I'm looking at it, family offices could very well perform the function of the impact investor once the structure reaches to them, once they're made aware of this. And on the other side, you have NGOs, number of NGOs and implementing, executing organizations could do well. I have not seen many cases like this in India. I may be ignorant of such cases if they are, but I think tremendous amount of work can go around in awareness and creating the structures, because especially if it's something like a development impact bond, then closing the last mile such that the money flows back into the to repay the impact investor. Okay, so that is something which it becomes, in the initial part you have a small number of players, easier to control, but towards the last mile the number of players become large, so obviously the control becomes more difficult. And that's where I guess Brother Kundan has expertise in designing this. I'm really eager to find out more about that. And awareness is a key, definitely. I think the timing is right for India, which is a capital-starved country. And lastly, the multiplier effect. Obviously, when you have brought in sustainability into this, and if capital is being conserved, and with every cycle the capital can go back to doing more development, it's a huge multiplier effect. I love this. Thank you again for this wonderful opportunity to listen to you, Kundan, and thank you, Brother Manoj, for bringing me into this. These are my thoughts from a very lay point of view.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your thoughts. And Gadi, if I can probably add just one thing to what sir said. So your entire thought on CSR money being available in India with the new regulation and a lot of family offices being risk investors, I think that the idea is to bring in more Indian investors into these programs, because what we have seen is majority of the projects that have been funded in India so far we have received more money from foreign donors and investors than from local donors and investors. And of course, there is a major restriction with the CSR law that a company with a CSR budget cannot directly fund outcomes, for which Social Finance India has done an innovative model with the Haryana Education Impact Bond, where CSR money also can be used. But I think a lot of more CSRs coming into these programs, and a lot of Indian wealth management firms, Indian family offices, and Indian impact investors coming into these programs can be a big boost for the social financing space in India. And Gadi, before I conclude, I'd like to address this one comment from the chat box. Somebody's asked if the government is shirking its responsibility by outsourcing these services to, say, a not-for-profit. Yeah, I think it was Sai Kumar who was asking that. So the way governments see these programs, and given that in India, governments are not funded impact bonds, but at least in other countries where governments have gotten directly involved, like the UK, US, Singapore, and many other developed countries where the governments are funding these programs, the way they see it is that they want private parties like not-for-profits and other institutions to innovate and see what works. And because, see, the government does not lose money here, right? If the program fails, it only pays if the program is successful. And once the government understands which program is successful, which program is not successful, then the idea of the SIPs and the DIPs is to then mainstream that into policy. So while this is, this market currently, only the impact bonds market, I'm not talking about the entire impact investing market, but specifically the impact bonds market is very small. It's even less than $500 million, right? It's that small. So the idea is not to turn this into a 10 billion or 100 billion market. That's not the purpose of the entire instruments over here. The instruments are to find out what works. And once the governments find out what works, the idea is to mainstream that into policy, mainstream that into their own schemes and projects, right? Because, for example, the case that I've shared about the New York City project failing, that is a clear message to the government and the implementing agency that that specific program does not work, right? So instead of government, say, implementing that program as part of its regular scheme or project, and then realizing after 5 years that it is such a waste of money, it is using these mechanisms like SIPs to run those programs in a smaller environment by measuring impact and outcomes clearly. And once it understands what works and what does not work, the government is in a better place to then adopt the right project as part of its regular policy and schemes, right? So I think from a innovation perspective and finding out what programs work, what programs don't work, these instruments can play an excellent role, right? And once we know what works, then a lot more funding, traditional funding, can go into those programs again. So I think I felt that was very important to address before I conclude this session. And thank you everyone for your time. Gadi, over to you.
Yeah, fantastic, Kundan. It hardly it hardly looks like you are at the beginning of your career. You have had such deep insight and hold on to this topic. Wishing you all the success to make DIP something that is dynamic and huge force to address address the chronic issues that plague Indian society. Thank you, Kundan, for making available your time and effort and articulating this in a wonderful manner. And of course, request all of you to take a look at our website. It's SciDevTalks.in, and this recorded version of this session will be on our YouTube channel as well. Please help us get to 1,000 subscribers at the earliest. Thank you, everybody, and we will be ending this session. Thank you.